The Existence and Nature of God, Professor John J. Haldane.
The question, has science discovered God, is one that I want to approach from the point of view of philosophy. And what a philosopher is going to be interested in is answering the question, how could science discover that there is a God, or indeed how could philosophy discover that? Perhaps the easiest and best way of approaching this is by offering a few introductory remarks about the way in which philosophy emerged from other ways of thinking about the world and trying to explain it, because that's also related to the emergence of science as a way of trying to understand the world. When cultural historians ask themselves the question, when and how and where did philosophy begin, they look to the ancient world, and in particular to a period in history where one kind of narrative or story seemed to give way to another. The older kind of narrative or explanation is one that has come to be known as the mythopoeic. That's to say, in Babylonia and the civilizations of the Near Middle East, it was customary to tell stories that were designed to explain some aspect of the world or of human experience. So, for example, it might be that it was observed that human beings are at war with one another. And so the question would arise, why is that the case? And the answer might be given by telling a story, a narrative, a myth, in which, let us say, there were several gods, and these gods were at war with one another, and they created peoples that were going to represent them, armies on earth, as it were. And those armies on earth are the different peoples of the world, and that's why they're fighting, because they're carrying on the battle of the gods. Now, the trouble with that kind of story is not that it's false, though it may be. It's rather that it's regressive. That's to say, it takes the thing that we needed to explain, why there's conflict, and explains it by positing some further level of conflict, a conflict among the gods. What the first philosophers did, and what made them philosophers, was see that that kind of explanation isn't satisfactory. If we ask ourselves the question, what is the nature of the world, or what is the nature of human experience, it isn't really going to be an adequate answer to just introduce another world or a stage behind that. What we need to try to do is understand how a phenomenon such as order or change, conflict or love, whatever it might be, understand the very nature of those things. And so philosophy and science were born out of this shift from the telling of poetic myths, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or some aspects of, say, Hebrew scripture in Genesis, moving from telling stories to trying to give explanations. So what is it that these earliest philosophers and scientists were trying to explain? Well, just the same things that we are still today trying to understand and explain, namely the nature of the world and its origins. One of the first things that they observed was that if we examine some local part of the world, or we examine something more broadly, the heavens perhaps, what we see is that so much matter or stuff is organized or has a certain configuration or shape or pattern. Now, in the ancient world, they introduced a formula to try and describe and explain this. It was the idea that the unlimited had imposed upon it a kind of limit or structure. And so if we just take a handful of earth, for example, what we see there is that we have some stuff, some matter. But if we look around, we see that that stuff or matter is limited, shaped, configured, formed in certain ways to make the different kinds of things there are. So this is the basis of a very simple scientific explanation of the world. We see the world as configurations or structurings, organizations, orderings, patternings of stuff or matter. Now, the question that immediately comes to mind is this. First of all, where did that stuff come from? And also, where did the ordering or structuring that it has come from? And those questions were first asked 2,500 years ago and continue to be asked today. So let's take up some of the elements that are part of the explanation here. We have on the one hand stuff or matter. We have, on the other hand, organization or form, the way that that matter is arranged. And in thinking about these, we can be led to see that there's a question of origins that needs to be addressed. If we take any particular thing, let us say a leaf, a plant, an animal, even a rock, we can ask the question, what is it? And answer that question in terms of describing its nature. But we can also ask the question, how is it? How does it come to be that it is? So on the one hand, we have questions of nature, and on the other hand, we have questions of existence. And what we should see is that understanding the nature of something doesn't answer the question, why does it exist? After all, you might read in a storybook about some kind of animal in some faraway land, and you might ask yourself the question, okay, I understand what this kind of animal is supposed to be, but are there any? So, for example, in the Middle Ages, people wrote narratives about foreign lands, foreign travels, and so on, came back with these wonderful traveller's tales in which they described various kinds of strange beasts and serpents and so on. But the question you would want to ask is, okay, I understand what they're meant to be, but are there any? Now, the nature of a thing doesn't guarantee its existence. That's to say, if we understood a certain kind of animal as being what we would call, say, a unicorn, clearly the nature of unicorns, what it would be to be a unicorn, doesn't guarantee that there are any. So understanding the nature of something doesn't explain the fact of its existence. Well, what does explain the fact of its existence? Well, since a cat or a leaf or a tree does exist, but might not have existed, we have to see its existence as deriving from the existence of something else. The coming to be of a tree or a cat or a leaf is to be explained in terms of the existence of something else that gives it its existence. So we could ask that about the matter that forms the animal or the plant. Where did that matter come from that gives it its existence? Or we could ask about the structure. Where did that structure come from? And if we pursue this question, what we come to see is that we are going to get a regress here. That's to say, we'll explain the existence of one thing in terms of another thing from whose existence it flows, and so on. But if we're ever to have an explanation, then we have to come to rest in something whose existence explains the existence of other things, but whose own existence follows from its nature. That is to say, unlike cats, plants, animals and rocks, there must be something whose nature explains its own existence, and whose existence and nature explains and accounts for the existence and nature of other things. And that's one of the most ancient sources of arguments for the existence of God, that as we investigate the world around us, we find that there are things that do exist but that might not have existed, whose existence does not follow from their nature. We find that the nature of those things exhibits certain patterns, that those patterns are not self-explaining, and so we're led by stages to introduce the idea of that which is the cause of existence and that which is the source of the order and nature of things. Now, what I want to do next is to explore in a little more detail some of these styles of arguments, particularly as they bear upon three questions. One, the historical transition from inanimate, lifeless matter to life. Secondly, the transition from life to consciousness. And then thirdly, the transition from consciousness into the kind of intellectual mindedness that human beings seem to be capable of, that allows them to engage in science and in philosophy. So what I'd like to do now is to look a little bit closer at some of the arguments that have been given for the existence of God, some arguments which I believe are good arguments, under the heading of explaining the nature of things, not the mere fact of their existence, but their nature. And I want to draw attention to 3 points that merit attention. First of all, the transition from inanimate matter, lifeless matter, to life. Secondly, the movement from life as such up to the level of sentient or conscious life, the kind of state of existence that's enjoyed both by animals and by human beings. But then thirdly, the higher level of existence, intellectual existence, that's exhibited by human beings when, for example, they do such things as engage in talking about philosophy and science. So let's begin with the transition from inanimate matter to life. When we try to understand the nature of something, the best way of approaching it is by seeing what it does, by seeing how it acts and reacts to its environment. Now, chemicals, of course, engage in actions and reactions, but these are to be explained simply in terms of the regularities, the kind of molecular structure and so on, the way that things are bound together, the way that they grip together, the way that they come apart. But there is a kind of action and reaction to an environment that's characteristic of life. And this involves such things as replicating itself, so living things reproduce themselves. Living things also direct themselves in their activities. They move towards, say, exchanging matter with their environment, taking in food, expelling waste material. When we get to the level of sentient life, animals move around in their environment in search of food, in search of mates and so on. They react to things like the passing in front of them of other objects, of other animals. And the question is, how are we to understand these activities that are characteristic of life? And how are we to see them as arising out of matter? And the key to identifying the problem here is the issue of reproduction itself. Because what we've got to try to explain is how it is we get from inanimate, lifeless matter, which does not reproduce itself, to a situation of entities that do. Now, this involves, in terms of a kind of evolutionary history, a discontinuous change. Up to a certain point, or up to a certain period or phase, what happened in the universe can be explained simply in terms of physical and chemical reactions. And it's true today, at this point, that at certain levels, as we go down into the molecular and so on, what happens in the universe can be given a physical and physical-chemical explanation. But there are these higher levels of functioning, of organization of matter, into living forms. And the mystery is how that kind of existence is to be explained in terms of the more basic molecular physical-chemical existence. And as I say, the point of focus here is on the issue of reproduction. Now, anybody who wants to say that there isn't a philosophical problem here is going to have to say that there is a smooth transition from the earlier stages of the universe from which life is absent to the later stages of the universe in which it's present. But the question is, how are they going to do that? How are they going to explain that? Because reproduction brings onto the scene something that wasn't there before. Well, what they're going to have to try to do is say that what preceded reproduction was sufficient, was enough to get reproduction going, but wasn't itself reproduction. Because, of course, if it was itself reproduction, then we've just pushed the question one stage back. We're back to that old regress problem. We're trying to explain the origins of reproduction, and so we can't explain the origins of reproduction in terms of things that are already reproducing. So what people will start to say are things like this: well, we've got maybe proto-reproduction. That is to say, we've got certain chemical-physical reactions that are not themselves reproductive, but they're on their way to being reproductive. But this really isn't an explanation, it's just a cheat. The fact of the matter is, either we've got reproduction or we haven't got reproduction. If we have reproduction, we don't seem to be able to explain it out of something that isn't already reproducing. And if we have reproduction already, then we haven't yet explained it. Now, there has been, as one would expect, a good deal of work done on this, scientifically, trying to understand the origins of life. But what these seem to push us back to are just sort of earlier stages in the story where we still have things that need the kind of explanation we're looking for. That is to say, we push back to DNA, RNA, and these various elements that are much discussed, amino acids and such like. But we don't seem to have an explanation of how reproduction could have arisen. Now, let me just, as well, hold that issue there for a moment and move up to the next stage, because a similar problem is going to arrive at that stage. Supposing we have basic cells reproducing themselves, how do we get from that kind of form of life to the kind of life that is enjoyed by cats, dogs, mice, human beings and so on, namely conscious or sentient life? Because consciousness seems to bring with it a further stage of development, just as life itself represented a change, a significant dramatic change from what preceded it, so consciousness or sentient awareness, feeling, represents a very significant change. Again, if we're trying to understand this style of life, what we do is we look at how conscious things behave. We observe that animals look around at their environment, they move in response to things that they observe, they move in response to the impact of that environment in terms of pain and so on, they move so as to satisfy needs and desires that they have. And this complexity of behavior has at its core consciousness, sentient, felt awareness of an environment. And just as we had a difficulty in explaining how reproduction could have emerged out of something that was non-reproductive, so we now have a difficulty explaining how consciousness could have emerged out of something that was not conscious. And then the third point of transition that brings us to ourselves and the kind of activity that we're engaged in now in discussing these issues is the emergence of intellect. Not merely a sensitive awareness to one's environment, to felt warmth and pressure and so on, but an ability to, as it were, abstract from all of that, to draw back from all of that, and to think about things. An ability not merely to respond to an animal as something that might be a friend or a foe, but to think about what it is for something to be an animal, to think about the very business of animality, of life, and so on. These are exercises of intellectual abstraction, theory building, and so on. So what we have here are a history in which there's a movement from inanimate matter to replicating cellular existence, life, a further transition from animate existence to conscious existence, and then a yet further transition from conscious existence up to the level of intellectual existence. Now, the issues that are raised by these transitions can be posed in two ways. That's to say, we can ask the question right now of something, say a human being, how are these different levels of its existence related one to another? How is the intellectual aspect of my life related to the conscious aspect of my life? How is that related to animality, being a biological entity? And how is that biological reality related to the physical-chemical reality, this mass of particles and stuff? So we can, as well, at a given time, look at this layering. Mind, consciousness, life, down to matter. But we can also, as it were, turn that diagram on its side and ask as a question of evolution or development, how do we get over time through these phases? Now, one answer to this question, or one attempted answer to this question, is introduced by speaking of emergence. What some people have wanted to say is this: well, over the history of the universe, what's happened is that when matter gets to a certain level of complexity, there emerges this a further level. So matter becomes organized in certain ways, and then that leads to life. Life pops up, as it were, gets added to the stack. And then when biological properties reach a certain level of complexity, then consciousness arises up out of that. And then again, at a certain level of complexity, consciousness gives rise to intellect. But these metaphors of giving rise to, or of emerging out of, or producing and so on, aren't really an explanation. They're just a description of the thing that needs to be explained. Emergence isn't a theory or a scientific explanation of the arising of consciousness or mind or life and so on. It's just a description of the thing that needs an explanation. It's just saying, well, what we know is this, that, or what we believe we know at any rate is this, that so many billion years ago there weren't living things around, certainly there weren't intellectual things around in nature as far as we were aware of it, and now there are, so they must have emerged. But that isn't an explanation of their emergence. As I say, that's simply a description of the thing to be explained. So how can it be explained? Well, explanation can take two forms. One kind of explanation with which we're familiar is where you describe and give an account of what's happened in terms of regularities. That's to say, if a child observed somebody putting sugar into their tea or coffee and noticed that it dissolved, they might ask the question, why did that happen? Why was it that that heap of white powder which went into the liquid then disappeared? And you might tell them a story about how it is that sugar dissolves in water, and in a liquid. So why is it that this happened? Well, this happened because that's what happens with these things. Okay, but why is it that sugar dissolves in liquid? Well, we might go up to the next stage of pattern or regularity and say, well, whenever things of this granular structure are put into material of this other kind of structure, then such and such happens. And we could, of course, press that question and explanation to the molecular level. But notice what we're doing is we're explaining an event as being an instance of a general pattern or regularity. And this is one of the most fundamental forms of explanation, explaining events in terms of patterns or rules or laws, as we say, laws of nature. A happened given this other thing because whenever this other sort of thing happens, then something of the sort A happens. Now, if that were the only kind of explanation, then I think we'd be in some difficulties. Because what we'd have to say is this: well, we don't really understand, and perhaps never could understand, how it is that intellect emerged from consciousness, consciousness from life, life from inanimate matter. All we could say is, whenever matter becomes sufficiently complex, then life arises. Whenever life becomes sufficiently complex, consciousness arises, and so on. And we wouldn't hear, we'd have sort of intermediary explanations, but we wouldn't have an ultimate explanation. We'd just be coming to rest by saying, well, that's the pattern of these things. Nothing further to be said. But of course, if there is nothing further to be said, then we really don't have an explanation. All we have is a series of observations of what has happened, not an explanation of why it has happened. Fortunately, however, there's a second kind of explanation. And this is one with which we're very familiar. This is explanation by reference to purposes or reasons. If, for example, I pick up this pen just now and unscrew the cap and rescrew it, and we ask the question, why did he do that? It would be not very helpful to suggest that whenever somebody is in such and such a situation, they do this kind of thing, because that would simply be false. It's not true that whenever anybody is in a given situation, they pick up a pen, unscrew it, and so on. The proper and natural explanation would be to say, well, he did that for a reason. In this case, to offer an example, to make a point. So what we realize now is that there is a second kind of explanation of why things happen. Not an explanation in terms of laws or regularities, but an explanation in terms of agents and their purposes. So if we go back to the problem of emergence, we can now see that the attempt to understand this, the philosophical attempt to describe and explain what's going on, needn't come to a halt in just postulating certain regularities, because we can at that point shift to the other kind of explanation. We can say that these regularities themselves are explained, not by more regularities, because that would be back to the old regresses that aren't satisfactory, but by saying that these regularities are to be explained by reference to a set of purposes and an agent whose purposes they are. So we can see what we've done so far is starting out with the observation that there are things that exist and have certain natures. We've seen that the existence of things calls for an explanation, that the nature of things doesn't explain their existence, and so we had to posit the idea of something whose nature does imply its existence and whose existence explains the existence of other things. And we've also seen that from looking at the nature of things, in particular looking at mind, consciousness, life, and so on, that in the attempt to explain the natures of things, we are pushed back, and now if we're to have an answer, if we're to halt that regress, we shift again to a being that is the source of the nature of things as well as of the existence of those things. Now, it's worth at this point observing that whereas the argument for the existence of God from the mere existence of things doesn't tell us very much about God at all, other than there is a cause of existence, the argument from the nature of things does begin to tell us something about the cause of the universe, because we know that that cause must be sufficient to account for the emergence of mind. It must be sufficient to account for intellectual nature. But only something that was itself mind-like could produce something like mind. And so, from the fact that minds exist and are not explained naturally, we now have reason to posit a mind itself that lies behind nature and is the cause of nature through its various levels, leading up to and perhaps beyond the emergence of mind. Now this, I think, should lead us to a further reflection, because we could ask ourselves the question, what's the point of all of this? What is the point of nature with its evolution over these billions of years, leading from inanimate matter all the way up to intellect? Well, what we've seen is that there's reason to think that behind all of this lies intellect, a mind, a creative mind, and we know that we have minds, and we know indeed that we are in our own limited ways creative. And this might suggest that the intermediary world, as it were, the world of living things, of matter and so on, is a kind of mode of communication between this original mind and our own minds. And what this perhaps will remind us of is the old idea of nature as being in some way the book of God. Now, I'm not suggesting that in any simple way we can just read off from nature the mind of God, but what I am suggesting is that the scientific inquiry, the scientific enterprise and the philosophical enterprise of trying to describe and explain nature may also be an answer to the question, why do we exist? That an intellect has made a natural order in and through which intellect itself emerges through these developmental stages, in order that there should be a kind of communication between minds, that we exist to come to know the cause and source of our own existence. And of course this will remind some people of a kind of catechism answer, to know, to love and to serve God. What is the purpose of our existence? To know, to love and to serve God. Now, of course, the kind of knowledge of God that religious believers would hope to have is something that in this world would come through revelation, or they would claim would come through revelation. But I'm suggesting that independently of any religious revelation, through scientific and philosophical reflection, one can develop an argument of the sort that I've been concerned with here that would lead to the conclusion that human beings exist for the sake of coming to know the cause of their own existence, that human minds exist in order to know the divine mind that is the cause of their being. Perhaps the most actively worked area within contemporary philosophy is the philosophy of mind. This degree of interest dates from the second half of the 20th century, when people, professional philosophers, turned their attention once again to the very nature of human beings. Of course, that had been the subject of philosophical inquiry across the centuries, but there was a new intensity of interest, born in part out of the development of empirical psychology. In the 19th century, in Germany and in Britain and in North America, the science of psychology had begun to develop, and by the second half of the 20th century it had really gone quite far and had raised a number of questions that philosophers saw a need to answer about the way in which mental states, mental attributes, the ability of thought, to think, to be conscious and so on, how these were related to states of the brain. And famously we have at the core of this the mind-body problem. What is the relationship between having a mind and having a body? Is having a mind just a way of being an organized body, or is it something distinctive? Dualists famously hold that human persons are really a union of two things, a physical body and an immaterial mind. Materialists claim that we're just one thing, a material body, and there are some philosophers, idealists, who claim that we're just one thing, namely a mind, that there is no matter. What I want to address, however, is a more specific question within the philosophy of mind, namely the nature of intellect. What is it to have the kinds of minds that human beings are possessed of that enable them to engage in mathematics, in science, in philosophy, in theology, and so on? Now, it's perhaps easiest to see what's at issue here by drawing a contrast between two aspects of mind. On the one hand, there's consciousness. There's the kind of felt awareness of your environment. There's feeling the warmth of the room, seeing the colours in front of you, smelling the aroma of freshly ground coffee, tasting the coffee as you drink it and so on, feeling pains, aches and pains in your body, feeling sensations of pleasure and such like. All of that falls under the head of consciousness. And we've every reason to believe that we're not alone in the universe in being conscious beings. Anyone who has a cat, for example, will easily be persuaded, or need no persuading, I suppose, of the idea that their cat is conscious, and so it is with many other animals. In fact, perhaps most other animals, but we didn't worry about the question of how far consciousness goes down the animal chain, as it were. But there's another aspect of mind that it would seem I don't share with my cats, and that is intellect. Now, consciousness is structured by sensation. To be aware of something in front of you involves having certain sensations, impressions of colours, of sounds, of textures, and so on. And conscious states, that's their medium. They're structured out of that. Just like a painting, for example, is structured out of pigment, canvas, whatever it might be, paper, oil, and so on. These are the materials out of which the painting is fashioned. Experience is structured out of these sensory qualities. Tastes, textures, felt textures, colours and such like. So now we can ask the question, what is the intellectual side of mind structured out of? What are the building blocks of thought, the things that correspond in thought to sensations in experience? Well, the building blocks of thought are concepts, ideas. Our thoughts are articulated structures, like sentences, if you like, whose building blocks are concepts. And expressed thought, language, is a parallel to that. Sentences in a natural language, in English and French and so on, are built up out of words. Now, words are more than just sounds. A sentence has a meaning. Its meaning is not to be reduced just to the sounds, any more than a painting is to be reduced just to the pigment and canvas out of which it's fashioned. A painting has a narrative content. If we look at a portrait, let's say, we can ask ourselves the question, what's it made of? But we can also ask ourselves the question, what does it say? What's it about? What does it mean? Who is this figure? And likewise, with language, there are the sounds that we utter, or the marks that we inscribe on a piece of paper when we write. But those are the material basis of language, but language also encodes or embodies meanings. And the question is, where do these meanings come from? Not just out of the marks. Well, where they come from is thought. They come from our concepts. Okay, well, where do our concepts come from? Now, this is one of the most profound questions in that area of philosophy that links the philosophy of mind and the theory of knowledge. What is the origins of our knowledge? What are the origins of our knowledge? And there is an ancient debate between two schools of philosophy, or two sets of schools. On the one hand, there are those who say that our concepts, our ideas, are got through experience entirely. And there are those who say, no, our concepts or ideas are something that we bring to experience. We already have them. Those who say we already have them are innatists. They say that concepts are innate. Those that say that we acquire them through experience, that belongs within the famous empiricist tradition, and that process of acquiring experiences is sometimes called abstraction. That you get your concepts, you get the idea of a square or of a circle and so on by observing squares and circles, by seeing squares and circles, and as it were drawing out the concept from that experience. Now, I've argued in the past and maintain the argument that that story of where concepts come from, that says that you acquire them through experience, can't be right. In fact, it doesn't make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because in order to see a circle, in order to direct your attention towards a circle, or a square, or a triangle, you have already to have that concept. In order to attend to something as a circle, you already have to have the idea of a circle. So it can't really be the case that all our concepts are got just through experience, simply as it were lifted off the world, because we have already to have the ideas before we can attend to the world in that way. Well, does that mean that we should be innatists? Should we think that all of our concepts come with us when we're born? Well, that doesn't seem to me to be very plausible either. For one thing, we have plenty of concepts, such as the concept of a pen and so on, or of a television camera, which it would just be mad to think we were born with. And so the innatist story is going to have to say, well, we're born with simpler concepts, and these other concepts are built up out of them. But that, people have worked on that project, but it doesn't really seem to have borne much fruit. Well, where then do we get concepts from? Well, one idea is that we get concepts in being taught a language. That's to say, when parents or older people are instructing a child in a language, one of the things they're doing are giving them concepts. When you say to a child, look, this is a square, this is a circle, this is a triangle, through these words you're communicating to them certain ideas. Now, in order for this to work, two things have to be the case. On the one hand, the child has to have the potentiality for acquiring those concepts. It doesn't have to have the concepts already, but it has to have the ability to acquire those concepts. And secondly, the teacher, the instructor, the parent, whoever it might be, themselves has to have the concepts. So we have the idea that human beings come by concepts not from lifting them from the world, because that doesn't make sense. You need to have the concept before you can recognize the world, if you like. Not by having them innately, but acquiring them through communication. As a child learns a language, so it acquires concepts. In order for that to be the case, the child has to have an innate ability, not innate concepts, but an innate ability to be taught, to acquire concepts. But it also has to be the case that somebody already has to have the concept or concepts, namely the teacher, the instructor, the parent. Now, I think we can see that we're going to get one of these regresses going again, because the question is, where does the instructor get concepts from? Well, we can say that they got their concepts in learning a language and communicating with others, but of course for that to be the case, they had to have the potentiality or the ability to acquire concepts, but there had also to be people who themselves already had the concepts. Now, what we're coming up against here is a very deep question about the origins of human language. But since we've made the connection between language and thought, we could as easily say this is the problem of the origins of human thought. Where do humans get concepts from? If we're to have an explanation of this, we have, I think, at some stage to move to the idea that human thought is something that is established, something that is created, something that is set going by a source beyond human beings themselves. It's not going to do us any good to introduce extraterrestrial communicators, because that will just push the story one stage back. We'll be back to one of our other regresses. We need to get to a point in which we have something that has a mind, that communicates part of its own thoughts and contents, but whose mindedness is not explained in terms of something behind it. Namely, that is to say, something intrinsically minded, something whose very nature is mind. And that nature is not something acquired, but something possessed. Now, the idea of God that is the cause of existence, that is the cause of the nature of things, that is itself an uncaused cause of these, fits just what we're looking for, because we can now, as it were, add to the list of these attributes of this entity, this being, this source or cause, mindedness. That human intelligence flows down, as it were, from divine intelligence. Now, that, of course, is not to suggest that human beings have a great deal in the way of access to the mind of God. I'm not making a claim about that. What I am saying is that the nature of language as the expression of conceptual thought calls for an explanation that is ultimately only going to be available if there is an intrinsic source of mindedness that, in creating beings, communicates that ability, that intellectual ability or power to those beings. Now, it's worth perhaps developing a further aspect of this line of reason. Because the distinctiveness of mind as being the place or locus within which concepts are shaped, developed, and organized into thoughts sets mind apart from other aspects and attributes of human animals. Mind, in its intellectual capacity or aspect, transcends mere consciousness. Consciousness goes beyond mere biology. Biology goes beyond mere physics and chemistry. But what this begins to, the question that this begins to raise in our minds is, if intellect is utterly distinct, if it is something that goes beyond matter in this way because it's an ability to understand matter, it's an ability to understand nature, it's something that is, as it were, is above nature in this way, that raises the question as to whether or not human beings are, as the dualists have postulated, really a union of two things: a material body, a biological entity, and then on the other side this immaterial mind. Well, that's a very deep question, but it seems to me that we should perhaps not rush to any simple kind of dualism, because if I'm right about these other stages of discontinuity in human evolution, we would also have reason to think that there's something not materialistically reducible about us as conscious beings, or indeed even as animals. That, as it were, our nature as rational animals is something that transcends the material base at already at levels below intellect. That, as it were, the kinds of animals we are is not something that's materialistically explicable. Now, in saying that, of course, it wouldn't follow that rational animals such as we, simply in virtue of having these powers of life, consciousness and so on, it wouldn't follow that we weren't mortal beings. It may be that although our nature transcends matter, the destruction of the matter out of which we're formed would be our destruction, would be our end. So the question as to whether or not there's any prospect of human beings surviving death seems to me turns on the issue of our intellectual nature, because it's there that we seem to have the highest level of discontinuity. It's at that point that we leave not just our material natures behind, but we leave the kinds of natures that we share with animals behind. Because once we get to intellect, there comes onto the scene the possibility of self-knowledge, of knowing what one is, that one is, reflecting upon the meaning of one's existence, the meaning of human nature more generally, moral consciousness, moral knowledge, philosophical, theological, scientific knowledge, and so on, all form part of this intellectual nature. Now, if concepts transcend the world, if concepts are, as it were, abstract, immaterial ideas, and this aspect of our nature involves us in dealing with these, then in that respect our natures themselves, one might suppose, have an immaterial dimension. And so the issue and prospect arises of the possibility that the death of our bodies and of our lives as rational animals might nonetheless leave space for the prospect of the survival of our intellectual natures. Now, supposing an argument of this sort can be made out, one question that might be asked is, how attractive a prospect is that? That is to say, most people, when they think about the idea of survival of death, are inclined to think in terms of a rather sort of rich afterlife of experiences shared with friends perhaps and other separated souls and so on. But in the view that I've just been describing, what would survive death, if anything does, would be our intellects, our minds, the highest in their highest aspect, not the consciousness, not the felt aspect of mind, the smells, the colours and so on, not that aspect of mind, but the intellectual or idea aspect of mind. Now, one might wonder whether or not this amounts to much of an existence, whether it amounts to something that anyone would have a desire for. But if we recall the argument that suggested that thinking about nature reveals to us the existence of a mind that caused our existence, and it caused the rest of nature also, then a certain prospect for the afterlife comes into view, namely that the surviving intellectual element of human beings is, as it were, comes into communication with the intellectual source of all existence. And so on this picture, the afterlife that reason might incline us to believe in would be one of a meeting of minds, as it were, not as it were walking in the fields, hand in hand, so to speak, but an intellectual engagement as created minds come into union with the creator mind. At this point, it may be useful to bring together some of the arguments for the existence of God that we've been looking at in the form of a diagram that sets out something of this structure. What I've gathered here are a number of related lines of reasoning, but I've brought them under two headings right at the top here. We've encountered a style of argument that derives the existence of God from the mere existence of things that might not have existed, so-called contingent things, myself, the camera that's filming me just now, the watch on my wrist, and so on. Each of these things exists, but its nature, the nature of each of them doesn't guarantee their existence, and so their existence has to derive from the existence of something else, and so we're driven backwards to the idea of a cause of existence that is itself uncaused. That's the line of cosmological arguments. But we also argue from not merely the existence of things, but the nature of things, from their character, and draw as a conclusion not merely that there is a cause of existence, but that the cause of existence itself has a certain kind of nature, that it has an ordered mind, that it has certain purposes, and so on. And this is brought under the heading of teleological arguments, arguments concerned with a telos, or an end, or a goal, or purpose. Now, if we look at this diagram a little further, we see that just as there's a division between cosmological and teleological arguments, within teleological arguments there's a further distinction between arguments from mere regularity, patterned regularity on the one hand, and arguments from directedness, where on this side it's just the case that, well, this happens whenever that happens, but over here we have things happening towards a certain end or goal or purpose. If we look at the arguments from regularity, we can see here that they themselves divide between two styles of arguments. There are arguments from the general causal laws, the laws of nature that govern the behavior of matter, and arguments from the so-called specific fine-tuning. Over here, an older style of argument says, look, the existence of matter and the behavior of matter depends upon there being certain regularities, the rotation of particles, the angles of rotation, the astronomical rotations, the gravitational attraction, and so on, these various patterns that exist. Those patterns can be explained in terms of higher order patterns, but we come eventually to the highest general causal laws, and those by definition have no further explanation in terms of yet more general patterns, and so the argument was we have at that point to move to God. But over here we've got a style of argumentation that has become has attracted quite a lot of attention in recent years, the arguments from specific fine-tuning, the argument that says, look, it's not merely that we observe regularities in nature, it's that we find that the conditions necessary for the existence of any kind of order or any complex order, the conditions necessary for that are highly specific and could not be expected to occur by chance. Well, leaving behind arguments for the moment just from regularity, moving across to look at arguments from directedness, we can make a distinction here between what I call non-intentional directedness, that is to say, where things are behaving in a way that they're not directing necessarily themselves towards certain things that they regard as purposes. For example, the behavior of some living things, indeed of all living things at some level, or of reproductive species more precisely, involves a certain kind of directedness. Their activities are directed towards certain ends, but we needn't assume that those living things have those ends in view or in mind. When animals mate for the sake of reproduction, we don't need to suppose that they themselves have any idea about the nature of reproduction or its purpose. But over on this side, we have intentional directedness, that is to say, where the activity of living things is pursued for a purpose that those things themselves have and recognize. Now, in order for that kind of intentional directedness to occur, it's necessary that the beings in question should be capable of thought. And when you're trying to decide what to do, you're thinking not about actual situations, but about possible situations. And to do that, you have to envisage possibilities, and you envisage possibilities by getting your concepts together in a certain way to describe those possibilities. And so you couldn't direct your own activity unless you had concepts. And so that brings us to the issue of the origin of concepts, what I put here, representational, conceptual modes of presentation, to use a philosopher's bit of jargon. And again, we have the argument that, well, are those innate or are they acquired? And if we try to suggest that they're acquired through something like social induction by learning a language, then again we come up with the regress that, okay, that's fine, but in order for that to be possible, it must be the case that A, human beings have the potentiality to acquire language, but secondly, there must be people who already have the power of language, say the community, but that now is unexplained. And so, as we proceed down this diagram, what we find are a variety of arguments, differing in their specific details, but alike in the respect that they have this basic form, that there is something of which we're aware through observation. Science, if you like, is just a highly refined form of observation of nature, but you don't need to be a scientist to observe the most basic instances of this. We're aware of the existence of things, things that exist but might not have existed. We're aware of the natures of things. And when we ask questions about how, why, where, and so on concerning these, we are driven to postulate explanations that take us to a further stage. But if ultimately we're to have any explanation, it must be that we trace this down to something that explains but is not itself explained in terms of something else. Now, is it acceptable to posit something that explains but is not itself explained? Well, it wouldn't be unless the nature of that thing was such that it guaranteed that it should exist and that it should have that nature. And this returns us to perhaps one of the most ancient arguments, an argument that's found in Thomas Aquinas and in other authors, that says, in the case of God, and in the case of God uniquely, God's nature and God's existence are one. That uniquely in the case of God, God's existence flows from God's nature. That's not true of anything else. It's not true of the objects that surround me just now, the objects that surround you, but it is true of God that God's nature is minded existence, and our nature and the nature of the world we can see as flowing from that divine nature in an act of continuous